All right, welcome back, everybody. We're here talking about the 1980s, starting to close down a little bit on this decade. Today's focus is going to be on sports during the 1980s. Now, we don't get into a lot of details on sports from topic to topic in here, decade to decade, but it's a little bit different with the 80s because it's during the 1980s that sports really grows and becomes such a much bigger part of our popular culture. So that's why its relevance in the 80s kind of returns a little bit from where it had been in a couple of previous decades. And other sports like basketball grew tremendously during this time. So let's talk a little bit about this, right? So uh, during the 1980s, sports really hits new heights in popularity during the 80s. This is largely due to ESPN and the ability to broadcast a lot more televised sports than ever before. We see, um, you know, most sports have a spike in popularity during the 1980s, particularly football, definitely basketball at both the college and pro level. Excuse me. Also, we see the growth and popularity of some smaller sports like golf, um, tennis, maybe a little bit, uh, and sports like that. The old staple sports like baseball and boxing, we're starting to see to kind of fall, not so much, not completely out of popularity or anything, but they're really being challenged and overtaken by, you know, basketball and football for popularity in this country. So the 1980s is a period where we really start to see that happen. Hockey grows in popularity during the 1980s. Hockey's always been more popular in like certain regions of the country, like Detroit, Minnesota, and places like that. In the 1980s, we see hockey, start to take on a little bit more popularity in the United States, more than it had ever been prior to that time. By the 1980s, we see the continued growth of football. You could argue that during the 1970s is when football overtook baseball as the most popular sport in America, but it was clearly evident by the 1980s. The Super Bowl by the 1980s was the marquee sporting event of every year. It's the sporting event where you get all the big sponsors to invest. It's the one sporting event that everybody watches, from football fans to casual football fans to people that don't even watch football, that maybe just watch the game because A, they want to see what the commercials are like, or B, maybe it's because they want to see the halftime show. It's during the 80s that the Super Bowl halftime show began to become like a really big deal, and you'd start to get big name acts and things like that to perform at the halftime of the Super Bowl. Prior to the 80s, the halftimes were really nothing all that exciting. But especially by the mid to late 80s, the Super Bowl had really become a big event and something that people really wanted to be a part of. One of the interesting things about it too is, you know, more or less, the Super Bowl at the end of the year is usually a pretty good football game. In the 80s, the Super Bowls were pretty bad games. Yeah, the Super Bowls were really bad games. Uh, Often were blowouts. There were some massive blowouts. The Super Bowl 20 in January 1986, 46-10 win for the Chicago Bears over the New England Patriots. The year before that was a blowout. The year before that was a blowout game. Uh, the year after Super Bowl 20 was a blowout. I mean, thinking back at it, so the first Super Bowl in the 80s would have been Super Bowl 15. Um, for those seasons would have been 15. 15 was a blowout. 16 was a decent game. 17 was a decent game. 18, 19, 20, 21, 22, um, 24 were huge blowouts. And the only really good game that whole decade was Super Bowl 23. But nevertheless, the game was extremely popular. The NBA grows in great popularity too, really at both the pro and college level. ESPN really started to broadcast a lot more college basketball in the 1980s, making college basketball more popular and relevant. It also helped that this is before there was you didn't have athletes come out of college after 1 year, like the one and done deal. Occasionally you'd have somebody skip college and just go right to the pros, but that didn't happen. So the best athletes, the best players would play in college, and most of them would play at least 3 or 4 years at the college level. And it made college basketball really competitive during the 1980s, especially in the Big East Conference, where they had some big power teams, and there was a great deal of interest and buzz that surrounded college basketball. What ushered in college basketball as a really popular marquee sport was actually the college rivalry in 1979 that culminated with the 1979 NCAA championship game, which is still the highest rated NCAA basketball championship game ever, of Indiana State versus Michigan State and Larry Bird versus Magic Johnson. From that point on, college basketball just grew in popularity during the 80s. In 1985 is when the NCAA tournament expanded to 64 teams, so it looks like the tournament that is so popular now. So we saw that happen in the 1980s. And then when you're talking about the NBA also grows tremendously in popularity during the 80s. The 70s were a rough period for the NBA. There were lots of problems with athletes and drug abuse and problems like that. The NBA had a real bad image problem too. And there were talks that the NBA could have gone out of business or failed in the 1980s. If not for Larry Bird and Magic Johnson, they saved the NBA. You know, there was that whole black guy versus white guy thing that was a big piece of that was a big piece of it between the two of them. But they were also exceptional basketball players, two of the best players ever. And of course, midway through the decade, you get Michael Jordan. So that's good. Without question, the biggest sporting moment of the 1980s happened really early in the decade. In February 1980, the Miracle on Ice, when the United States hockey team beat the Soviet Union in the Olympic semifinal game to make it to the gold medal game and ultimately win the gold medal at the Lake Placid New York Olympics in 1980. This was a big deal because nobody in their right minds believed that the U.S. could have won this game. It might be the biggest upset in the history of sports. The Soviet team would have been like if the Dream Team, like the original Dream Team from 1992, was playing against, it would have been like if somebody would have beat that team, the basketball team in 1992, the Dream Team. That's how good that Soviet team was. And somehow the United States managed to beat them. We went on to beat Finland. We went on to beat Finland to win the gold medal, and the rest is history. But this was a kind of a hugely big moment for the country. This is in the middle of the Cold War, and so often our victories in sport were treated as if they were battlefield victories in the fight against communism. And the Miracle on Ice was certainly a big deal here. You guys don't understand the Olympics as a Cold War metaphor, but the Soviet Union ended when I was about 12 years old, and I remember those first couple of Olympics in my life. Where we were fighting, where the Cold War was still going on. It was a big deal to beat the Soviet Union in sports. And they were our biggest competitors. So the Olympics back then were really very competitive. It was really important to be able to beat the Soviets in anything, even if it was a minor sport. But to beat the Soviets in a game that they were best at, hockey, was huge for our country. Another big thing we see develop during the 1980s is the marketing of athletes. And we'll get into this a little bit with tomorrow's video on advertising. But we see athletes become more marketable than we've ever had them before. most notably in the sneaker industry or the shoe industry, becoming a big cultural force for pushing the sale of items and goods and stuff of that nature. The first Jordans come out in 1985, and you've got other athletes that have shoe contracts. You have athletes that sell, that put together contracts to market other goods. And it becomes a big deal to sign these athletes. The top guys in college, the shoe companies were lining up like Reebok, Nike, Adidas. They'll be lining up, wherever. As soon as the college athlete signs a pro contract, they want to sign him to a shoe contract, right? And be able to sell shoes that are representing that particular player. So we see kind of that shoe culture be ushered in the mid to late 80s and only grow even more during the 1990s, as well as athletes endorsing many other products as well. In the 1980s, athletes become more bigger household names than they'd ever been before, right? Uh, in previous eras, you might not know the average casual person might not be able to name five NBA players or five football players or whatever. But by the 1980s, even people that weren't basketball fans, they knew who Michael Jordan was, and they knew Magic Johnson and Larry Bird and Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, or Julius Erving, Dr. J, Patrick Ewing, just to name a few. Joe Montana in football, Walter Payton, people like that. People knew who these athletes were, and sports were becoming a much bigger part of our culture. Probably the most successful franchises of the 1980s. It was interesting in the sports here. Notice I don't have any baseball teams, but you've got the 49ers in football. They're certainly the most dominant NFL team of the 80s. They win 4 Super Bowls. The Lakers and Celtics in basketball in the NBA combined to win 8 of the 10 NBA titles during the 1980s. Every year except 1983 and 1989 was won by the Lakers or Celtics, or was won by Magic Johnson or Larry Bird. In baseball, you see a lot of parity during the 1980s. In the 10 years of the 80s, 9 different teams won a World Series. The only team that won 2 were the Los Angeles Dodgers in 1981 and 1988. So it's an era where we don't see kind of every sport have dominant teams like there's not one in baseball. But we see sports like basketball emerge, especially that rivalry between the Lakers and Celtics. The 49ers are the new dominant football team of the 80s, and that again helps grow the popularity of sport. So here's some of the popular athletes from the 1980s. Okay, now in previous decades, when I'd show you some of these folks, you didn't necessarily recognize who they all were. I'm willing to guess that before I put any names down, you guys can probably identify all these people, except for maybe 1 or 2. So, again, in the early 1980s, tennis was really popular, and this was largely led by a guy named John McEnroe, who's him down here. He was extremely popular as a tennis player, largely because he was a really aggressive player, and he was really like loud and obnoxious, and would yell at the tennis referee a lot and say some crazy things. So he was regarded really as this ill-tempered, angry guy. I'll send you a couple clips of some of these people. But he was so good at tennis that he helped grow the popularity of the sport early in the decade. Obviously, Magic Johnson and Larry Bird are 2 people that you can't really separate. 2 of the best basketball players ever, arguably 2 of the top 5 players ever, definitely 2 of the top 10. Larry Bird won 3 NBA titles and 3 MVPs in the 1980s. Magic Johnson won 5 NBA titles and ultimately 3 MVPs in the 1980s. The last one was in 1990, but close enough. So they dominate the basketball landscape through much of the 1980s, certainly at the team level. Even with Michael Jordan, Michael Jordan in terms of winning and being successful for the Bulls as a team, especially if you've been watching the Jordan and the Bulls documentary. It's really their period is the 1990s. Mary Lou Retton is the Olympic darling of the 1980s, along with a guy named Carl Lewis, who was a track star. Mary Lou Retton was the first American woman ever to win a gold medal in the women's individual all around in gymnastics at the Olympics. So she won a gold medal in 1984 and then immediately becomes a big celebrity, and she gets all these commercial deals, and she's on the Wheaties box, and she does a lot of other things. You can still see Mary Lou Retton on commercials from time to time. She becomes this darling, and it's kind of a big deal that when an American girl wins the women's gymnastics all around, they become big celebrities, whether it's Mary Lou Retton or Simone Biles or Gabby Douglas or Carly Patterson or any of the or Nastia Liukin. Those are all the American women to do it, but they tend to become fairly well known, and people can identify them outside of just those who are fans of the particular sport. And of course, people only care about gymnastics once every 4 years. Along with Michael Jordan, Wayne Gretzky is probably, at least according to most, the greatest athlete ever to play their particular sport. And he becomes the dominant hockey player of the 1980s, helping really to grow the popularity of hockey in the United States. Even though he played for a team in Canada for most of the decade, at the end of the decade, he started to play for the Los Angeles Kings and helped to grow their popularity. So he's an extremely popular athlete, and he's, I guess, the Michael Jordan of hockey. Pretty much everybody believes he owes about every major record in the history of the NHL, and is certainly a prominent figure within that sport. Another example of a great athlete from the 1980s is Mike Tyson. Mike Tyson was a devastating power heavyweight boxer. Probably, some people might say that the 80s were like the last great decade for boxing. Not so much at the heavyweight level, but more at the middleweight, and smaller weight levels with guys like Sugar Ray Leonard, Thomas Hearns, Marvin Hagler, Roberto Duran, and people like that. But the 80s are really, this final time for really great boxing. And Mike Tyson was in his time maybe the most devastating boxer anybody had ever seen. I mean, he just demolished guys in the 1980s, and he was a massive celebrity. Now, most of you probably can't even identify a boxer today or name one. But again, Mike Tyson was a big celebrity, and everybody knew who he was. I would say if you had to rank the most famous athletes of the 1980s, if you would say that the average person would know who they were, you'd have Magic Johnson probably number one, and Jordan number two, Larry Bird number three, Mary Lou Retton, and probably then Mike Tyson. Everybody knew who Mike Tyson was. He was married to an actress, and that gained a lot of attention. And people were just shocked at how absolutely devastating he was as a fighter. His boxing matches weren't that good because he just killed everybody so quick. I'll send you a clip of that too. Obviously, Michael Jordan. Michael Jordan emerges during the 1980s. He becomes the biggest athlete in terms of marketing that we'd ever seen by the end of the decade. But he doesn't have a lot of success in the 1980s in terms of team performance. He only makes it out in the 1980s. He only makes it to the conference finals one time. Only makes it out of the first round of the playoffs with the Bulls twice in 5 seasons. So the Bulls don't have a great deal of success, but people by the 1980s know who Michael Jordan was, and he was certainly on his way to being regarded as the greatest player in NBA history. Bo Jackson gains a lot of attention in the 1980s as being marketed as an athlete. He's America's first kind of great, first great kind of two-sport athlete. He was playing the NFL for the for the Raiders, for the LA Raiders, and he played in baseball for the Kansas City Royals. So he's extremely popular, and he won the Heisman Trophy in 1985. He was really incredibly good, like so athletic at both sports that he gained a lot of attention. And again, became part of that whole shoe culture. You can see the Nike up here, and many other products for marketing, this athlete that was so good that he was an all-star at both sports. He's the only athlete ever to be an all-star in both baseball and football. There have been other guys that have played multiple sports, but nobody's ever been as good at both as Bo Jackson. And then finally, here you've got Joe Montana, who would be like the Tom Brady of the 1980s, was a quarterback of the San Francisco 49ers. He won 4 Super Bowls and was really a dominant figure in terms of quarterback. You didn't have, if Joe Montana was Tom Brady, uh, Dan Marino was Peyton Manning. Dan Marino usually put up better numbers than Joe Montana, but Joe Montana just knew how to win. And he certainly was um, the most famous, notable figure in football uh, during the 1980s. So anyway, that's about it. I'll put this up here for you shortly, and a couple of videos for you to watch with some sports highlights from the 80s, and send you the last one tomorrow, folks. All right, see you.